Hello and welcome. Special segment on the In the Money Media YouTube channel, which we encourage you all to subscribe to. I know from looking at the data behind the scenes that most of you are not subscribed. That helps us out a lot, helps other people find the channel, helps you catch all of our Derby exclusive content. We're going now. We changed the goal. I'm going to say 15,500 by Derby because we're doing so. We've picked up, but we got to pick up more steam. But that's besides the point. I want to tell you about my guest today, who's a man who has a deep and storied connection with In the Money. He's been actually on these shows from before they were even in the money. Back in the old the DRF podcast days, he was in our Derby drafts, a frequent guest, always very insightful when it comes to racing. He's got a terrific podcast of his own, but he's also got a new book we're going to be talking about. That's called Betting on Horses. At the end of the video, we're going to talk about the title here of How to Bet the Kentucky Derby. But I think before we get into the specifics of this year's Derby, Chris, I want you to tell us a little bit about the book. Why don't you start with the inspiration for putting it together?
Yeah, really, it was a follow-on to my Bet with the Best podcast, and I started that because I thought, there was a lot of good content out about particular races and some good handicapping content, but the betting side tended to get kind of short-sighted. So I really wanted to focus around how to become a complete horse player, not just a handicapper, but actually be able to figure out how to identify value and really leverage your good opinions through the mutual windows. That's
Yeah.
what the Bet with the Best podcast was all about. And I did that for a couple of years, and I thought, you, that's nice. It's a great way to get this information out. But I would like to. I thought I had enough content to try to organize it in a way that would help people kind of get it all in one place, right? Bring it
Yeah.
bring it all together.
And what I love about it is the way you synthesize the information. You know, in my life, I've done several books that were largely quotes from gamblers. I used to think I was the person, and I still might have you on this by a little, but who'd interviewed the most horse players of anyone alive. That which I consider a great honor. You've come close, if not surpassed me at this point. But what I really like about the book is the fact that it didn't really follow the model of the stuff that I was doing years ago with 6 Secrets of Successful Bettors with Frank Scottoni, or the poker books I did for DRF Press. This is very much of synthesized information by themes, and a lot of them very modern. Because I think when you go back to a lot of the classic literature in handicapping now, I mean, a lot of the stuff is still true, but a lot of it's dated and it's not pitched at the modern world. Even the books I did, even the Mike Maloney book, which is one of my favorite things I ever worked on, that's more than 10 years old now. And it shows because the world is changing. And I like the fact that you're talking about some of the issues that horse players are facing today, and you're putting it together in a way that makes it feel very fresh and welcome. So congratulations on putting it together in that realm. Was that something you did? Were those things you were working on consciously?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, the first draft I wrote was more like what you had described you had done. And I had a few people review that and give me some really good feedback. Marshall Graham was the first person I showed it to. Really sharp guy. He's one of the people that is included in the book. And he gave me a lot of good feedback. And it was clear, if I wanted to really make a book that's maybe worthy of being on the shelf next to some of the really good books that used to come out, years ago that we don't see anymore, I needed to really put more of my own thinking into it and make sure I really organized it in a way that made sense and that people could use as a reference. And so that's what I tried to do. And like you said, Mike's book was probably the last real horse player book written, and DRF Press went away. And so there really isn't anything kind of modern and up to date. So I wanted to kind of fill that gap and provide something to people they could use in today's racing world, which is very, very different than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure people understood, how the game has evolved and how it's changed. And you could still learn a lot from those people who were really successful in the past. It's
For
just
sure.
you have to realize the game has changed and you have to find your own way. You can't just copy them, what they did, but you can copy the way they thought about the game and the way they approached it. And that's what I try to do, is get people to understand what I call the gambler's mindset, that the idea that in order to win at a game like this, you have to separate yourself from the crowd. You have to find an edge. and you have to realize those edges don't last for very long. So you have to really exploit them when you find them. And then you have to be looking for the next edge if you want to continue to be successful over time. And so I use those past players as kind of examples of how they went about that, and then try to talk about what some of the new modern challenges are that players have to consider when they try to find their own way. And that's what you have to do. I mean, there's no one size fits all. There's a lot of different ways to approach this game, and that's one of the things I show in the book. Some almost contradictory ways between players that both were successful, but they had totally different strengths and ways of thinking about the game, which is fine, and that's what makes it fun.
For sure. And I think you really hit on something that we've talked about from the early days of the pod and the YouTube channel, which is that idea of trying to find your own handicapping personality, your own gambling personality. What is the right answer might be the right one for you. It might be wrong for somebody else. And you sound like a lawyer when you say this, but the answer to so many of the questions surrounding horse racing and all gambling really is, it depends. Speaking of lawyers, I do want to shout out the Mike Maloney book. No, excuse me. We already did that. The Matt Miller book, the other.
Oh, yeah, right.
Which is not a traditional handicapping book by any means, but does, I think, in terms of the mentality, in terms of the gambling, get into a lot of the same areas. That one's called A Better Way of Thinking. You interview Matt. He gives you a lovely blurb on the back of the book. So I knew you wouldn't mind my mention.
Well, that's a great book. And it wasn't really a horse player book. It was more of, like you said, the gambler's mindset, same theme, focus primarily on tournaments, which I do cover in the book, which I think is a great part of the game today that we didn't have 30 years ago.
The best.
But this is really directed towards horse players, and I try to be real comprehensive and talk about all the things it takes to become a horse player, not just, and it's way beyond just handicapping, and even just the gambling. It's things like trying to understand what your preferred style is, and the horse player psychology and how that can impact you positively or negatively, and just a lot of different aspects of playing the game that don't typically get talked about, but are probably just as important as handicapping, or more so in some cases. So did I lose you, Pete? You froze on me.
I do just want to underline that idea you mentioned before about the book being almost, to me, it's less teaching how to handicap and more teaching how to think about the game. And that's something that's pretty cool and different that I think almost no matter what your level, you're going to be able to learn from. I have one more book question for you, and then I promise we'll get to the approach to the Kentucky Derby stuff that I know some of the people are here for. But the hardcore and the money types are going to want to know. We've mentioned a couple of them. Who are some of the other names that appear throughout the pages of this book that you enjoyed speaking with?
Well, there's some of sort of the usual suspects like Andy Beyer and Steve Christ and Barry Meadow and Mark Kramer, guys that have kind of legends of the game, or have written some great books, the books that I read and really got a lot out of. So, but I also bring in, professional players like Mike Maloney. You've mentioned him, but Paul Matisse, and even some of the younger guys like Dennis Montoro, who's a computer player, and I use him to help give people a little bit of understanding of how these computer models work, and I go into a lot about the computer teams and how to try to compete with them. And then so it's kind of a mixed bag of some of the older players who maybe were really successful in the past. Another name I want to mention is Len Friedman. He was really good.
Len's great.
And what I tried to do is, like, for each of the players that I talked with, I try to feature them in one of the sections of the book, so that kind of bring them in and a little bit of their history. But then I would bring in what many of the other guests had talked about on the same topics, so that you can get a sense for what different players thought about these different aspects of the game.
It becomes a conversation. Yeah, it becomes a conversation. We did a little bit of that in 6 Secrets of Successful Bettors, but again, more than 20 years ago. Like, it's more than an update. It's just a completely fresh approach. All right, we just have a couple of minutes left, Chris.
All right.
We're talking about mentalities. Let's talk about your mentality specifically. I'm not going to ask you to necessarily give out a horse. If you want to talk about a short list or something, feel free. But this, I want to be more about what the right approaches are to the Kentucky Derby.
And I think there's a couple things you have to pay attention to. One is just that the large field of 20 horses is pretty unique in American racing, and so you have to realize that there's a little more chaos typically in the Derby. It's a little harder to predict, so you need to it's harder to say this horse is an even money shot in the Derby. You have to really think about, given all the things that can happen, is this horse really going to win half the time they run this race? And so I think you have to kind of calibrate what your fair odds are on horses given that field size. So maybe it's a horse you love in the Derby. In a normal day at the races, say with an 8-horse field, and you say, hey, I'd be willing to take 4 to 5 on this horse. But in the Derby, that's probably not a price you want to take on a horse, unless maybe it's Secretariat. But even if you're as old as I am, and remember, there were questions around Secretariat. Even he had lost in the Wood Memorial.
Yeah.
This is the invincible horse lost to his stablemate. So was it the same horse we saw too? Now it turned out he was, but you have to adjust your thinking in terms of what's fair value for a horse. I think that's one thing that's really important about the Derby. Understand that trips are huge, and so if and then the other thing is the pools are really big, and there's more casual money in the pools than you typically find, and you can actually find, and we talk about this every year in the win pools. There's usually some crazy horse or two that get way over bet for some hard to predict reason,
A
but that
person's name,
inflate.
a fun name, right to
Yeah,
party could be that the horse this year. You don't know why, but you do see those trends, and it creates value elsewhere, right?
right. And the other good thing about the Derby, the pools are so big that the computer teams can't really correct all the odds. They can't take on that much risk. So they're going to, lower those odds, but they probably don't fully correct those. So you might, have a little bit more of a, if you find an edge, you might actually be able to cash in on it more than you would on a normal day. So that casual money helps you're in terms of prices, and the fact that teams probably this is the one day of the year they probably can't fully correct odds, so you probably won't see crazy odd swings, and you probably can still you find that horse you like, it's going off at 8 to 1 and you think it should be 5 to 1, you might actually get something close to that 8 to 1 rather than at post time, and the final odds show up and it's 7 to 2, and
Right.
now you thought, well,
We're-
I thought it was a great bet turned into a not so great
Yeah.
bet.
The everyday horse player is familiar with that. We will have some newer people around here, and for them, I think that's a really important note. It's going to be very tempting to swing for the fences, look at that Derby Super, whatever. But if you're somebody who makes a lot of bets and you're looking at this because it's the Derby, but you're used to betting sports, your best bet might just be right there in the win pool.
Yeah, and that actually day-to-day betting, that might be your best bet. I think
Yeah.
simplifying your bets and learning to pass races. That's some of the main themes in the book. To be competitive now, it's hard to bet every race. It's just a tough way to try to play the game now. So if you can exercise some discipline and pick your spots, and then maybe simplify the pools you play into, because the more complex the pool, the tougher those teams are. They're so good at structuring their wagers precisely and siphoning all the value out of those complex pools. Unless you're really good at that part of the game, I think you're better off keeping it simple. But that Derby Superfecta with the $1 minimum is a very tempting bet if you think you're a good handicapper and you think you know how to structure tickets, because you can get some great payouts sometimes even when the favorites run well. If you can catch that one crazy long shot, a chaos horse, in that super, you can get a major payout. And one of the things I go into in the book with Mike Maloney is his approach to the Derby Superfecta. He has
Oh,
a really
fantastic.
great some instruction about how he approaches that bet, how he structures his tickets, and that might be worth the book all by itself if you're thinking you might want to tackle that Derby Superfecta pool.
Where can people get the book, Chris?
Go to betwiththebestmedia all one word, betwiththebestmedia.com, and you can find out more about the book, and you can click on a button and get the book if you want. It gets shipped directly to your house. And there, I got a discount price now. It's $10 off the price if you buy now, trying to build some momentum. And so far I've gotten a lot of good feedback, and it's you never know when you set out to do something like this what's going to happen. It was a lot of work, but I felt like I had accomplished what I wanted to when I put the book together. Now I just hope some people read it so that we can get the word out.
That's the idea. I'll pop the link in the show notes. We'll send it out on Twitter as well. We'll have you back for a longer visit soon. Chris Larmey, thank you so much. Check out the book. I've got it right here. Look at that. Betting on Horses, Key Insights from the Bet with the Best podcast. And if you're listening on audio, yeah, we'll put it in the show notes there too. We'll find a way to sneak this on an audio show too, because the real hardcore still listen rather than watch, but most people watch these days for whatever reason. Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pete. Thanks for the opportunity.